Welcome, folks, to this, our 8th webinar through GW Law School. This webinar, we're going to be discussing the Trump administration's actions against a number of inspectors general in the Trump administration. We're going to be talking about the Inspector General Act and how it's evolved over the years since 1978. And we'll be talking about some potential reforms to the Inspector General Act that are being discussed in response to the Trump administration's actions against the Inspector General. There are over 70 inspectors general in the US government, and the ones we're going to be focusing on today are the ones that are presidentially appointed and confirmed by the Senate. We have a very esteemed panel to discuss the issues that arise under the Inspector General Act. Just briefly, because we have audience members from all over the world. We have audience members from 5 different continents and from over 15 countries. I've been getting a lot of emails about what's happening in the United States. This is a unique time, and a lot of people have questions about the tragic death of George Floyd and some of the violence that we're seeing on the streets here. I should say, as an American, that what is happening in America is an issue that's been around for a very long time, and we as a country will sort this out, and as part of sorting it out, we'll do so with a deep respect for the rule of law. That's what really marks our country, and in many ways marks what we're talking about today with regards to the inspectors general, how to move forward to reform things with a deep respect for the rule of law. So thank you all for joining us. This session is being recorded. It will be available this afternoon in our time, in Eastern time in the United States. It'll be available through YouTube, and I'll be posting a link up through the program page, which is at publicprocurementinternational.com, if you'd like to watch the video afterwards. I've already posted the program slides, and I'll also be posting the program chat from today. So I'm going to share my screen now and walk with you through just some preliminary stuff. We're going to have, after introductions, we're going to have presentations by our panelists. All opinions being offered today are the personal opinions of the participants and the panelists, and they shouldn't be attributed to their organizations. After the panelist presentations, we reserve time for questions and answers. During the course of today's session, we'd appreciate it if, instead of using the Q&A function that's built into Zoom, you'll see it on a bar across the bottom of your screen. Instead of using the Q&A function, instead of using the question and answer function, please use the chat function instead, and the panelists will be responding to questions. Please feel free to ask any questions that you like. If there are important questions, we'll pull those back into the question and answer session at the end, but please feel free to use the chat function instead of the Q&A function. The Q&A function tends to be somewhat stilted. We prefer to use the chat function, and as I said before, the chat function, the chat will be part of the record of today. So we're going to be talking about a very complicated issue today and trying to boil it down for you. Jessica Tillman and I have prepared an in-depth assessment, an extended assessment of what's going on right now. It's posted. It's linked from the program page at publicprocurementinternational.com, and the website there is on the right-hand side. You can see if you want to drill down to that page, or you can just go to the program page at publicprocurementinternational.com and get to that assessment. It's about a 20-page assessment, and it includes, importantly, it includes videos, key videos, for example, addresses being given by President Trump. It also includes some historical videos from Steve Linick, who is the Inspector General of the Department of State, who was removed, and Glenn Fine, who is the Principal Deputy Inspector General at the Defense Department. He was the acting Inspector General when he was removed. And those historical videos are quite interesting. They were prepared in 2018 to mark the 40th anniversary of the Inspector General Act, and they really give the perspectives of these and other Inspectors General. Importantly, about Steve Linick talks about his perspective that he has complete independence as an Inspector General, and Glenn Fine talks about how gratified he is as a matter of serving his country, how gratified he is to be able to do that as an Inspector General. So we strongly encourage you to go to that resource page to see the legal and historical assessment, and then also to see some of the videos that we have linked there. Our panelists today include Jessica Tillman, who's my friend and colleague. She teaches an anti-corruption course with me at George Washington University. She's the assistant dean and professorial lecturer of law at GW at the law school there. Clark Urban is a partner at Squire Patton Boggs. Clark, who is also previously an inspector general at the State Department. Department during the George W. Bush administration, and then he was also the Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security. And he wrote a book about his experience. It's available on Amazon. I strongly recommend it to you if you'd like to learn more about his experience as an Inspector General, which we'll be talking about today. We also have Lisa Ryan from the Washington Post. She's written extensively on issues in the Trump administration, including the issues with Secretary Pompeo that we'll be discussing in just a few minutes. Noah Bookbinder, who's Executive Director for the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW. Noah has written extensively and been very active in reform efforts in this area involving inspectors general. So just to give you a quick sort of scorecard about the issues that we'll be talking about today, so you can follow some of the discussion. It seems complex. It's not as complex as it sounds. I just want to go through with you the key actors that we'll be talking about. The first one is the Inspector General for the Intelligence Community, Michael Atkinson, who is removed. As Lisa will be talking about, he was removed because he gave Congress a whistleblower complaint regarding Ukraine, and that ultimately helped lead to the impeachment of Donald Trump. There was no response. There's a 30-day period during which the announcement of the removal was made, and the removal actually is supposed to take place. During that period, there was no response to a congressional request for more information during that period. And also, the ground that President Trump gave for removing Inspector General Atkinson was that he had lost confidence in Atkinson. And the question is whether or not that was enough of a rationale to support the removal. Is a loss of confidence by the president enough of a rationale for removing an Inspector General? The next is Acting Inspector General Glenn Fine, and he was the Acting Inspector General at Defense, and he had a lot of experience as an Inspector General, and it's not really clear why he was removed. Lisa will be talking about that in a little bit more detail. He was an Obama appointee, and he opens the question as to whether or not, in fact, appointees from a prior administration should be removed just because they're from a prior administration. Acting Inspector Christy Grimm from Health and Human Services was moved from her position as Acting Inspector General because of a report, an embarrassing report that talked about failures in the Trump administration's preparations for the COVID-19 pandemic. Inspector General Steve Linick at the State Department has probably been the most controversial case. Linick was removed in Secretary Pompeo's words because he was not part of the team. And one of the questions we'll be discussing today is whether or not an Inspector General should be part of the team, administration's team, in order to, under the statute, or whether or not he should be more independent. The open question is whether or not Linick was removed to block an investigation, perhaps investigations involving Secretary Pompeo himself, and again, whether or not Trump's loss of confidence was enough of a ground for removal. The final issue, the new issue that Steve Linick raises is because his replacement is dual-hatted. His replacement as an Acting Inspector General has different responsibilities in the State Department. Should an Inspector General be dual-hatted is another issue that was raised. Finally, Acting Inspector General Mitch Bain from Transportation was removed, and it's not really clear exactly why he was removed, but it may have been related to a congressionally requested investigation of Secretary Chow. Secretary Chow is alleged to have, or the Department of Transportation is alleged to have given favorable treatment to Mitch McConnell, her husband, who is the majority leader in the US Senate. And the question is whether or not that investigation may have been part of the reason for his removal. So those are the main characters we'll be talking about, the main persons we'll be talking about, Inspector Generals removed. And now we're going to have Jessica Tolman talk about some background on the Inspector General Act. Thank you, Jessica.
All right, thank you, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I know there was a little bit of sound issue in the last bit, but you know, my job here today is to briefly explain to everybody the background, the framework within which we're working when it comes to what IGs are, their independence, their removal, their appointment. So I'm going to go over that briefly with you today. At the outset, I think it's important to understand that when it comes to U.S. anti-corruption mechanisms, there's the law, and then there's effectively what we like to refer to as an honor code or the norms. The law is what's written in regulation and statute, and then there are just certain assumptions or expectations that we assume our public servants would adhere to, even if it's not required by law. When it comes to IGs, many of us in the U.S. anti-corruption community have long touted the strength of the IG regime as an anti-corruption oversight mechanism. But now I think in recent months and recent years, we've come to realize that many of our assumptions about this regime were based on norms and not the actual laws themselves. So my job here today is to explain to you what the law actually says when it comes to IGs. So when we look at the role of inspectors general, we first have to ask kind of where do they fit into the big picture? One of the key anti-corruption mechanisms within the federal government is oversight, and it's provided in a variety of ways, whether it's legislatively through investigations by Congress, whether it's audits provided by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, investigations by the Justice Department. IGs are just another oversight mechanism within this larger regime, and they're a creature of the executive branch. They're housed within government agencies. They're responsible for conducting audits and investigations relating to the programs and operations of their particular agency. And then they're supposed to make policy recommendations designed to promote economy and efficiency within their agency, but also to prevent, detect, and mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse within their organization. They have to keep their agency head and Congress informed of what's going on, their work, and the problems within the agency. And they're supposed to be independent to ensure that there's objectivity within their work. Now, the primary statute that governs the IG framework within the United States is the Inspector General Act of 1978. Let me be clear at the outset, there are different types of IGs and different types of agencies that have different requirements. For purposes of today's discussion, to keep it simple, we're going to focus on statutory IGs that are presidentially appointed and confirmed by the Senate, so just one category of IGs. Now, the IGs as we know them today basically emerged after two historical developments. The first was after World War II, when we saw this kind of great expansion of the federal government. Auditing and investigative work shifted from what was then known as the General Accounting Office, now the Government Accountability Office, to the agencies themselves. In 1959, Congress established what's effectively the first Inspector General or Comptroller within the State Department, which basically provided the framework for future Inspector General, or what we know the regime to be today. In 1978, Congress passed the Inspector General Act of 1978, which I just mentioned before. This was in the wake of the second big historical event, the Watergate scandals, following the collapse of the Nixon regime. Now, this, for those of you that have studied this time period, or those of you that are familiar with the anti-corruption laws in the United States, there were a series of anti-corruption laws or other types of laws designed to reform our system in the wake of so many different abuses and corruption scandals within the law. So this was just another one of them. The intent of Congress under this act was to create independent and objective units within each agency and to make recommendations and improvement. The Act's been amended several times since it's been passed in the 70s, and there have been attempts to try to bolster the independence of IGs every time they've done some of these types of amendments. Now, the cornerstone or the key feature of an IG is that they're supposed to be independent because, again, without independence, you lack that objectivity necessary to really get to the root of some of the problems within agencies. So one of the first ways that IGs are supposed to be independent is through their appointment process. So Section 3 of the Inspector General Act says that an IG has to be appointed by the President and then confirmed by the Senate. Now, the qualifications for an IG is that this person needs to be selected, and this is a quote, without regard to political affiliation and solely on the basis of integrity and demonstrated ability in accounting, auditing, financial analysis, law, management analysis, public administration, or investigation. So that's effectively the qualifications you need to be an IG. Now, the IG serves under the general supervision of your agency head, but also has this kind of dual and independent reporting relationship to both the head of the agency and then to Congress as well. The IG is not supposed to report to any other officer within the agency. One particular issue that's arisen in I'd say even the recent decades is that there have been a lot of vacancies within the IG offices. Some people point to this particular confirmation process, that maybe it takes a little too long to be appointed and vetted and then confirmed by the Senate. And that's led to some issues that may be impacting independence. where acting inspectors generals may be perceived as less independent. They haven't gone through a formal vetting process. They may not be there around long enough to set long-term strategies. And then there's also the potential concern that they may not be as I don't know, so tough as an IG or willing to, report some of the fraud, waste, and abuse because they may still be auditioning for a job, by the president with confirmation from the Senate. So you worry about that as well. So that's just one issue that has arisen with respect to the appointment process. One other aspect of the IGs that's been written into statute is that the agency head is not allowed to prevent or prohibit the IG from basically initiating, carrying out, or completing an audit or investigation. They're supposed to have independence in this regard. And that's been bolstered by other federal laws that essentially say that IGs should have a separate appropriations account, and that's designed to make sure that the agency heads can't limit, reallocate, or reduce IG funding in order for them to do their jobs. Another independence component of the IG Act is that the IG needs to be transparent to both Congress and the public. Sections 4 and 5 of the Act basically require IGs to report regularly to Congress and the agency head about their work, whether that's their current audits or even their semi-annual reports to Congress about the preceding 6 months of investigations and work that they've been doing. This is also supposed to generally be made public, and we'll see a lot of these reports and audits released on the respective agency websites. There's also this fabulous website called oversight.gov, created in 2017 by SIGI, which is basically the Inspectors General Council, where it's a searchable website. You can search by keyword and other different features and filter through reports from almost all the agencies, not all of them, but the majority of agencies that have IGs use oversight.gov to post the report. So it's a great resource for anybody that's doing particular research into an issue. And that's got reports even dating back to 2000. One thing that's assumed about the IGs is that they don't wear dual hats, that they're not going to be both the IG and holding a separate role within the agency. Indeed, if you look at the legislative history of the Inspector General Act, Congress expected that these IGs would be independent and have no program responsibility to divide their allegiances. Here's the problem. This gets back to the norm issue. This actually was never written into the statute. There's no explicit prohibition in the law that says that you can't both be an inspector general and also run a program within the agency. It seems a little crazy because how can you be the overseer of an agency, but also be overseen by yourself? It's just a tremendous conflict of interest. And we're seeing that play out in real time as the Trump administration has recently appointed, and I'm gonna butcher his name maybe, Stephen Accard, who is now the acting IG for the State Department, who's also holding the position as director of the Office of Foreign Missions, a political appointment he's had since 2019. And as you can imagine, there's significant concern over the fact that he's now both supposed to be overseeing all of the agency operations, but including his own, and the conflicts of interest that really could stem from that. Now, the final portion I want to talk to you is about removal. A Senate confirmed IG may only be removed by the president with 30 days advance notice provided to both houses of Congress, along with a statement providing the reasons for removal. The 30-day notice requirement was established under the Inspector General Reform Act of 2008. So this was established in an amendment to the original Inspector General Act. Previously, the president only had to just communicate the reason for removal, but didn't have to provide advance notice. Now, this new requirement created in 2008 was designed to give members of Congress an opportunity to demand an explanation and respond to this potential firing of an IG. What's notable about the 2008 amendments is that it was strongly considered that they would amend the IG Act of 1978 to include a for-cause removal provision to try to limit the way that the president could remove an IG, again, only to major malfeasance or gross performance issues. And there was a long list of reasons that they were going to include that would be considered for-cause reasons for removal. This was ultimately rejected by the Senate and ultimately rejected in the amendments to the actual act. And what we really were left with was this kind of advance notice provision for removal, which doesn't require much of the president other than letting Congress know this is happening and a terse reason for doing so. Now, what's interesting is that Congress still seems to anticipate or expect that the IG is only going to be removed for cause. But the statute, again, The norms or the expectation, in fact, if you look into and listen to a lot of the different videos or different media statements from IGs in the past and interviews, I've heard them repeatedly say, you know, I could only really be removed for cause. I have true independence. But if you look at the actual language of the statute, the for cause removal requirement was rejected in 2008, and it's not in the original statute. So again, this gets back to the difference between statutory requirements and norms or expectations. So here what we have is, you've probably heard in the news some debate as to whether or not Trump's statement, basically that he's lost confidence in some of these inspectors general, whether that's enough. Congress has said that they think that's not enough. Whereas actually during the Obama administration, a removal of an IG went up to the DC Circuit, where they said a statement effectively that you've lost confidence in a particular IG was enough to satisfy this basic minimal standard that's been written into this amendment. So even though members of Congress are now saying, you know, it's insufficient for the Trump administration to simply just say you've lost confidence in an IG, that's actually contrary to the actual text of the law, you know, and to case law precedent. So with that, I will end my time and then turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Jessica. It's Clark Irvin here. So I'll talk briefly to start about the removals by Reagan and Obama. Of course, just a couple of years after President Carter signed the Inspector General Act of 1978 into law, President Reagan was elected. And President Reagan famously said during the course of his inaugural address, government is not the solution to our problems, but rather government is the problem. And I say that because one would have thought that a president with that ideological persuasion would have embraced the notion of inspectors general, having these independent watchdogs within agencies to ferret out waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. But actually, when he came into office, President Reagan attempted to fire all of the inspectors general. He was ultimately walked back from that, and most of them were reinstated. But in fact, that's what he did at the beginning of his administration. And likewise, when he assumed office, President George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, asked for the resignation of all executive branch officials, including the inspectors general. Ultimately, the inspectors general again were reinstated, but that's the backdrop following the signing into law in 1978 of the act. Notably, as Jessica mentioned, even President Obama, who generally was an advocate of good government, fired one inspector general, and as she said, the reason given was simply lack of confidence in that inspector general. And the facts were very interesting in that regard. There's not time to go into them, but the allegation is that the administration fired that inspector general because he was looking into the activities of a political supporter of President Obama. And also famously, the Obama Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel issued an opinion that denied to the DOJ inspector general access to certain information, grand jury info, wiretap information, credit information, even though inspectors general are supposed to be given free rein with regard to agency records and documents so that they can carry out their oversight activities. So that's the backdrop, but certainly the number and rapidity of IG terminations and demotions in the Trump administration are unprecedented. But as I say, there's this long and bipartisan history of presidential administrations being, at best, skeptical of the institution of inspectors general, and at worst, firing them for no clear sin other than the job of doing the job that they are statutorily required to do. This administration, the Trump administration, has, I think it's fair to say, made a practice of refusing to provide information requested both by Congress and by inspectors general as part of their oversight responsibilities. And notably, in his CARES Act signing statement, the president objected to that provision in the CARES Act that empowers the newly confirmed special inspector general, and in fact requires him to report to Congress, quote, without delay, close quote, when information that he requests or assistance that he requests from the agency, in this case, the Treasury Department, is not provided or unreasonably withheld. And there's a similar provision in the CARES Act with regard to the PRAC, the Pandemic Accountability Response Committee, this new committee of existing inspectors general to oversee CARES Act funds. Now to talk about the practical challenge, focus on investigations. What do we mean by a focus on investigations? In the early years of inspectors general, I think it's fair to say that most of them tended to focus on what I would call management audits, meaning narrow, uncontroversial reviews of administrative matters, like, for example, whether agency employees are abusing their credit cards, or whether employees are gaming the pay system by over-reporting their work hours and such. But over time, as the Inspector General community became more familiar with the powers that they had under the Act, and as they began to feel the full weight of the authorities that they had, they became aware of the powers that they had, and also members of Congress became to recognize that inspectors general could actually be used as a political cudgel against administrations of a different political party. And so over time, the combination of those things led inspectors general to issue the kind of hard-hitting reports that can make headlines and therefore politically embarrass administrations. And examples now, of course, are that HHSIG report about the state of hospitals' unpreparedness for the coronavirus that resulted in the demotion of the HHS Inspector General. And of course, the investigations that Steve Lennick had underway that Jessica has already commented on. Interestingly, it's the case that when administrations change, those in Congress who were supportive of the notion of inspectors general become antagonistic to inspectors general when administrations come into office that share their party affiliation, and the reverse is true. So I've always said that inspectors general, many of them served for many years through both Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. They often serve long past the administration that appointed them. So if they serve for a long period of time, as many of them do or have done over the years until now, if they're doing their job correctly, they will ultimately conduct audits and investigations and come to conclusions that anger Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, Republicans in Congress and Democrats in Congress. The difference today is that this kind of aggressive and independent approach, it's pretty clear, will result in your firing. And so no doubt the events of recent weeks and months are already having a chilling effect on the inspectors general who remain. Now, let me say a word about balancing transparency to Congress and the public. I won't talk about that much because Jessica covered it. I myself don't really see any tension between the inspector general's obligation to be transparent with Congress and to be transparent with the public. For one thing, the Congress is the public's representative, obviously. They're elected officials in the House and the Senate, and they're elected to represent the public. And so, as Jessica noted, inspectors general have a formal reporting responsibility to the Congress. They have these semi-annual reports that they have to issue every 6 months detailing their audit, investigative, and other activities and their effectiveness, commenting on their effectiveness with statistics to prove it. Also, every report that an inspector general does is issued, a copy of it is issued in real time to the applicable authorizing appropriations committees that oversee that agency. That's true even when inspectors general look into classified information. Classified versions of those reports are provided to Congress. With regard to the public, similarly, inspector general reports now are placed on the web in real time for the public to see. And at least in my case, and I think it's the case in the inspector general community, even when inspectors general, those in the national community who conduct classified audits and investigations, typically a redacted high-level version will still be posted for the public. So at least the public is aware of what the subject matter is and what the main conclusions are. I'd like to focus my remaining moments on what I think really is the most important issue, and that is the relationship, how optimally to handle the relationship the inspector general has with the agency head and the president or the wider administration. As Chris noted at the beginning, I served as the inspector general for 4 years, 2 years as the inspector general of the State Department, 2001, 2002, when Colin Powell was the Secretary of State. And for the first 2 years of the Department of Homeland Security, 2003, 2004, when Tom Ridge, the former governor of Pennsylvania, was the Secretary of Homeland Security. And the experience that I had really was night and day at both agencies. And it was a good experience generally at the State Department because the agency head, Secretary Powell, understood and appreciated the role of inspectors general as independent watchdogs whose ultimate boss is the American people. And regrettably, Secretary Ridge did not, in part, I think, because he came from a political background. In fact, he famously asked me once, after I issued one critical report after another regarding border security and other homeland security matters, are you my inspector general? I had an inspector general when I was the governor of Pennsylvania, And he never issued reports like this without my prior knowledge and approval. And I responded to that by saying, I'm not your Inspector General. That fundamental misconception of the Inspector General's role is the heart of the antagonism between our offices. I am the Inspector General of the American people. My accountability is to them. Both you and I work for them. And it's, if any good, I would argue, can come out of this period, it will be, I hope, a greater understanding, not just on the part of insiders and cognoscenti, those on this webinar, but of the general public, of just how critical inspectors general are to our whole constitutional scheme, and how important it is, as Jessica has pointed out, to have not just laws, but to have an appreciation on the part of the public and the Congress for making sure that those laws are not just norms, but they're actually enforced with the full weight of the law. And the final thing I'll say is about a relationship with the president. As Chris noted before we began the webinar, I had an unusual background in that I had a political one. I served for then Governor George W. Bush in Texas in a number of capacities. I'd even run for Congress in my native Texas beforehand and formed my relationship with the Bush family that way. So surely there was skepticism of me when I came to the State Department as an Inspector General, whether I would be apolitical. And in fact, I was. And perhaps the best proof of that is I remember listening in 2004 to then candidate for the Democratic candidate for president 2004, John Kerry, cite in the closing weeks of the 2004 campaign against George Bush, an Inspector General report that I had issued that was critical of the administration. And Senator Kerry said, your own Inspector General of your own party, of your own appointment, is making these claims. And I thought, I'm doing my job. Because even though I full well understood and appreciated the political consequences of my reports to the administration that appointed me, I was statutorily obliged to let the political chips fall where they may. And that is really the heart of the Inspector General notion. Lisa?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. I write for the Post and I cover the federal government. And there's really been a fascinating arc to watch in the Trump administration of how it has handled the IG community. The first thing I did want to say is, so there are about 75 inspectors general. A number of these positions are vacant in the Trump administration, as they were during the Obama administration. About 30 some odd of these positions. You know what? I have to get rid of my dog. Hold right there. Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm back. About 30 some odd of these positions are actually confirmed by the Senate, and those are the ones who are most relevant because for this conversation, because they tend to be large agencies. But the rest of the IGs are actually appointed by the agency heads, which is, creates other fascinating issues. So you have somewhere like the National Archives, where the head of the archives is actually appointing the IG who's overseeing that person. So in the Trump administration, in the very beginning, during the transition in late 2016 and early 2017, we had some interesting sort of foreboding for the IG community, and it's not clear whether this was a case of incompetence or whether it was sort of an act by design designed to ruffle the feathers of the community. IGs were all, the Senate confirmed ones, were given a notice that said, well, during the transition, we're going to allow you to stay through the transition. And then we'll sort of decide your fate after that. And so that kind of led the IGs to think, oh, so I'm going to be fired as soon as Trump comes up with new nominees. And there was a lot of alarm in the community. And then what happened was Democrats in Congress and some Republicans actually approached the general counsel's office. At the time, this was Don McGahn, And McGahn quickly put a stop to this and sent the message out to inspectors general that no, you're fine, we're not firing you. Then we had two interesting kind of, I guess, more bald attempts at politicization in the Department of Education and Department of the Interior. These both, I think the Interior one happened about 2 years ago, Education happened a year ago. What happened in Interior was the acting IG at the time, Mary Kendall, who had been in place for a long time, was doing some very tough investigations of the Interior Secretary at the time, Ryan Zinke, who, various conflicts of interest, potential conflicts of interest. There was an alarm in the White House and, desire to stop these. So Ryan Zinke and Ben Carson, who's now the Secretary of HUD, cooked up an idea to take a political appointee at HUD who was, apparently a problematic appointee who had been Trump's campaign manager in Queens, New York, and a lawyer who had no experience in IG matters, to bring her over as the acting inspector general. The understanding was she would never get confirmed, but they needed to have a caretaker who would make sure that these investigations of the secretary were being monitored. Anyway, these stories got out in the press, and the woman whose name was Suzanne Tufts quit suddenly, just left government suddenly before her interview with the group of IGs who tend to interview potential candidates. Then we had, or in the beginning of last year, I think the timing is right, we had Betsy DeVos, the now education secretary, did not like an investigation that her IG had started of her activities, her efforts to pressure to basically embrace for-profit colleges. So she attempted, to corral the White House into letting her just knock off the IG at the time, I believe was in an acting role. And she wanted to put her general counsel, another dual hatting conflict of interest, in the role of acting IG. And this effort was also stopped in its tracks because you had lots of criticism from Democrats in Congress and you had coverage in the press. So then we come to actually the post-impeachment era this year, which, as we all know, coincided with the start of the pandemic. And Trump started a post-impeachment, purge of a number of officials who had been involved, in his impeachment effort and who had testified in the case. But the one that's relevant for our conversation is the Inspector General of the intelligence community, Michael Atkinson, who was fascinating because he was actually a Trump appointee. He's the only one of the five who have been kind of, pushed aside or fired in recent months to be a Trump appointee, Senate confirmed. He's the one who, as we've all read, and I'm sure this crowd is aware of, who forwarded the infamous, now infamous, whistleblower complaint from the national security community about Trump's dealings with Ukraine to Congress. So, sometime in, I'm thinking late March, I don't actually, maybe it was early April, sorry, I don't have my dates right, but he was the first one to go. So boom, we've got a pandemic and we've got all attention on the pandemic. And, on a Friday night, all of a sudden, we've got a Friday night massacre and Michael Atkinson is gone. And the person who is appointed to replace him in an acting role, not as a nominee, I'll get to that in a second, but in an acting role, happens to be the general counsel of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which, as Jessica was discussing, is not quite a dual hat relationship because the general counsel, whose name is Thomas Monheim, actually took a leave from that role. But you could very easily argue that that is really kind of an unprecedented situation where you're taking someone who has served the agency, who is serving the agency that is overseen and monitored for waste, fraud, and abuse, especially the general counsel, very sensitive job. And putting him as in the acting role. Okay, then in quick succession, we had Glenn Fine, who was knocked off of his spot as the acting IG at the Defense Department, which is the largest community of largest IG staff in the government. Not surprisingly, it's the largest agency in the government. And the trigger for this, it's pretty clear, was that Fine had been announced. He had been appointed as well as in his DoD job, but he had been appointed as the leader of a sort of an oversight group of IGs who were going to monitor the pandemic spending. And so, Trump didn't like that. And so he basically, as a way to get him, out of that role, he basically demoted Glenn Fine in his Defense Department role. Fine, just last week actually resigned from his job, and he was very well-respected IG, although he had never actually been given the formal job, because he was, I think as one of the panelists said, he had been nominated under Obama, was not confirmed by the Senate before Trump came in, and Trump had left him in place. Then we had Christy Grimm, as been discussed. She was the principal. Actually, she still is technically, only because Trump nominated someone else who has not received, had a Senate hearing or been confirmed by the Senate. But Christy Grimm was the principal deputy inspector general at HHS, essentially the person in charge. A couple of maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago, she does this very critical report, kind of a quick hit, because the pandemic is requiring IGs to act really quickly, and just do quick reports that are useful to the public and to policymakers. And she says, look, all these hospital workers are having so much trouble getting PPE. There's a lot of disorganization. There's so much problems with the FEMA stockpile. Okay, and Trump was very, very open about his criticism of her, and actually said before the press at a press conference, who is he? Well, not knowing she was a she, who is this person? And I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like, let's get rid of them. And of course, there was in another Friday night action, Christy Grimm was essentially, this was a little tricky. She wasn't fired, but by nominating someone to take her place, she was effectively pushed aside. Then we had the 2 recent cases at the Department of Transportation. These were all past 2 weeks, Department of Transportation and the State Department, which I know you guys are all aware of. So at Transportation, this is an interesting case. My colleague Tom Hamburger and I wrote a big story about this, which I can try to email in the chat. But it was a fascinating case where they demoted the acting IG at Transportation, because the former IG had retired for health reasons. There was an acting guy in there. He was the deputy. He was promoted to acting. He was doing some investigations of Secretary Elaine Chao, one involving Chao's potential favoritism to the state of Kentucky in transportation grants. We know her husband is Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. The other had to do with potential conflicts involving her investments in a Chinese transportation company. Anyway, so the replacement in an acting role for Mitch Beam happens to be a guy who is an ally of Vice President Pence, who worked in Indiana with him, who maybe a competent official, but he happens to be a former CSX railroad executive who has been leading the Transportation Department's Hazardous Materials and Pipeline Division. Now, he has apparently, we are told, he has recused himself in his IG role of oversight over that agency. But, many, many people told us that just didn't really make any sense. That's a nice thing to do, but that there would be a lot of pressure on him. And then I think my time is ending, but before I end, the State Department case, which probably was got the most attention, Steve Linick was outright fired. He's actually on the Hill as we speak, testifying behind closed doors to the House Oversight and Foreign Affairs Committees. And in his case, we have a replacement in an acting role who is not even recusing himself, but who also was plucked from the agency and the problem there with the dual heading conflict is that this guy is the head of foreign missions. He oversees sort of the State Department's office that basically has oversight over, hundreds of foreign missions. So lots more to say, but with that, I want to let Noah do his piece. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, so I'm Noah Bookbinder. I'm the Executive Director of CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. We are an organization, nonprofit organization that promotes ethics in government and works to combat corruption. And I want to take just a moment for a little bit of context that, there's sort of, we're in the midst of multiple competing crises in the country. And I think a sort of an obvious question is, why are we talking about inspectors general, which kind of feels a little bit specific and bureaucratic? And I think you've heard a little bit about why inspectors general are important. You heard about the kinds of hard-hitting reports that Clark worked on, and inspectors general bring about accountability when there is wrongdoing in departments. They also really work to make the government work better. A couple of other examples of that. The last time we had a large-scale stimulus program was the TARP program, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, after the financial crisis in 2008. And that was a program that was overseen by a really aggressive inspector general. And one of the things that you saw was actually very, very little fraud, waste, and abuse, even with hundreds of billions of dollars going out. That's the kind of thing that inspectors general can do. In fact, the report that Christy Grimm, who you've heard about, the former acting inspector general at the Department of Health and Human Services, that she put out, could have been taken in that same spirit as highlighting some problems that could be solved to make government work better, to get supplies to medical workers who were working on the pandemic. The president chose instead to take it as a political attack. So that's one reason why it's important when you go after inspectors general, is that they actually make the government work the way we want it to work. But the other piece of context that I thought was briefly worth explaining is that this kind of crisis of attacking inspectors general over the last several months comes after years of this administration working to undercut all forms of oversight and accountability in government. So we have a system of checks and balances. We've got the executive branch, where the president and the agencies are. We've got the legislative branch, Congress, and a few agencies that report to Congress. And we've got the judicial branch. And traditionally, the other branches work as a check on the executive. But one of the things that we've seen is a systematic attempt to undercut that. So the president spent a couple of years saying that members of his administration should not be, as a policy matter, responsive to inquiries from the minority in Congress. More recently, once you've gotten a majority in the House that was going to do some real oversight, the administration has consistently refused to send witnesses, to send documents on a scale unlike that we've seen from administrations of either party before. The president has actually gone so far as to go to court to block outside entities from providing documents to Congress. The president has questioned the validity of the impeachment process, even though it's in the Constitution. At the same time, when there have been attempts to go to court to bring about accountability and transparency in this administration, the administration has been extremely aggressive in delaying and opposing all of those efforts. There have actually been cases where the administration has gone on the same issue to court to say, you can't address this issue in court, you got to address it in Congress, and then gone to Congress to say, you can't address this in Congress, you got to address it in court. And what it has resulted in is essentially nobody from the other branches effectively performing any oversight of the administration. So what does that leave? That leaves the internal mechanisms within the executive branch, the inspectors general, to provide some accountability. And so in some ways, it's only logical that the president has now turned his attention to inspectors general and has tried to essentially disempower that in some ways last vestige of oversight and accountability within the government. And so this is really important stuff. It really cuts to the core of our democratic system. You've heard a little bit about sort of what's happened, what the president has done. So I'm not going to, I won't go into that now. But there are some reforms that are out there that might reduce the ability of this president or any president of either party to undercut the effectiveness of inspectors general, particularly when they perform investigations or reports that are potentially critical. The one that has gotten the most attention, that's been part of a number of pieces of legislation, is for cause removal. So that's basically, that would be a legislative provision that says, as Jessica alluded to, it's not required in the law now, but that would say that you only can remove an inspector general for specified reasons. And they're reasons like permanent incapacity, inefficiency, neglect of duty, malfeasance, or conviction of a felony or conduct involving moral turpitude. That's what the provisions in one of the bills before Congress would say. That's pretty serious stuff, and would be a fairly, assuming that the law is actually going to be enforced if it's passed, would really restrict the ability to fire an inspector general just because the president doesn't like what that person is doing. There are actually other reforms before Congress that would potentially do other things, in some cases go even further. So that for cause removal, as I said, is in a number of different bills, including the HEROES Act, which is legislation that the House passed for pandemic relief, which also included some further protections of inspectors general. There's a bill called the CORE Act, which was proposed in the Senate by Senators Blumenthal, Warren, and Coons, and in the House by Representatives Sarbanes and Jayapal, which would have a for cause removal provision, but also require that when you didn't have an inspector general in place, when you had one of these acting inspectors general that you've heard about now from Lisa and from Jessica and others, that acting inspector general has to be somebody who is a career official from the inspector general's office. So it can't be a political person brought in from elsewhere in the department. That bill also would provide a legal cause of action for a fired inspector general to challenge the firing. It would provide outside review. You heard before about the group SIGI, the kind of Inspector General's Council. So it would provide for review by that body. Other reforms that are potentially at issue, Senator Menendez has legislation, which at least for the State Department Inspector General, if this legislation were to be passed, would provide for Congress to go in and pass a resolution overriding the firing. There are a lot of constitutional questions that some of these provisions might bring, but they would provide more security and more protection for inspectors general. So all of that's floating around in Congress. We'll see if there is another major piece of coronavirus relief legislation passed, if some form of protection for inspectors general is included. You've heard I've mentioned a number of members of Congress who are proposing these these pieces of reform legislation. There are actually a number of members of Congress of both parties who have been traditional champions of inspectors general. Senator Grassley, Republican from Iowa, is probably the most prominent defender of inspectors general, going back years and decades. As I said, there are Republicans who have traditionally taken that position. What we've seen during the current crisis is that a few of those members, like Senator Grassley, have at least in kind of modest tones challenged whether there was sufficient basis for the firing of these inspectors general. But we have not seen from the president's own party members of Congress coming out really strongly and criticizing in clear terms these firings, demanding further explanation, threatening to block nominees or appropriations, the kinds of things that could actually stop the president. We have seen some members emerge with proposals for protections. I think it's going to be a tough ride to get any of those through in this year, but maybe as part of a larger bill, something could get through later this summer if there is another piece of coronavirus relief legislation. I think more likely significant reforms are likely. I shouldn't say likely, but under some scenarios could be likely next year, and I think that's why a lot of these are being discussed and proposed now, in the hopes that there will be an opening for really major reforms to make this this piece of good government apparatus work the way it's intended to work. I know we're going a little bit over, so I will stop now and turn it back over to Chris for questions.
Thank you for that. No, it was excellent. So I want to start with a question that we actually received in the chat room, and a question that we talked about before during our preparations. One of the key questions, especially in the State Department right now, is whether or not the statutory ban against interfering with an investigation. It says in the statute that no one is allowed to interfere with an inspector general's ongoing investigation. And that may have happened in the State Department. That's an open question. But the question is whether or not that statutory ban is really enforceable. Noel, what do you think about that?
I think what we're seeing is what we've seen with in a lot of areas of government over the past 2 to 3 years, is that protections that we thought were sort of ironclad in the law actually rely on a traditional willingness to abide by them. And when you have an administration that has very little interest in complying with laws and certainly with rules and traditions that it doesn't find useful, it can be pretty hard to force it to do so. And so I think we're seeing that it is enforceable primarily by Congress and the public being outraged and yelling and screaming and dragging people into hearings and threatening to cut off funding, and in essence to shame the administration into not interfering. But it's not clear that it's legally enforceable. I think there are folks who are thinking about that issue and thinking about ways to try to use legal methods to enforce that kind of ban. But it seems like it is really the pressure is more on the political and the public side than on the legal side.
Chris, if I can just step in for just one question. I think what Noah's talking about and what I kind of mentioned in my own comments, it's not even just limited to this one issue. It's this overarching issue regarding norms and the law. Whether it's compliance with, ethics rules, even though the president and the vice president are exempt. We always saw presidents trying to comply with the ethics rules. Relying on something as kind of amorphous as an emoluments clause isn't enough. And so again and again, we've seen that there have been significant expectations and assumptions based on norms. I mean, for years, when you and I both, when we train and work with colleagues from other countries, we talk about the strength of the anti-corruption regime in the United States. A lot of it is based in statute, but a lot of it is also based on norms. And so I think the real challenge ahead of us is finding ways to really put these into law and codify a lot of these norms, so we actually have these kind of ironclad, well, as much as a statute can be an ironclad, protections going forward.
Thanks a lot. So, Lisa, I really have a political question for you, because you're closer to this than any of us. Do you think that the Trump administration's removals of inspectors general continue? And if so, who do you think might be next?
Well, I can say that the Inspector General community believes that they will continue, and is very concerned that someone may be next. I don't have any evidence, to say that there will be other IGs, who will go. But I do think, as we've seen in the cases of the ones who were previously either fired or demoted, just, during the pandemic, just, it does seem like they were cases where either the president, was close to the cabinet member and, had a sort of a bee in his bonnet about it, or had a bee in his bonnet about the case. I'm just thinking of the HHS case with the critical report. In the case of Secretary Pompeo, who obviously Trump is very close to. That's a hugely important member of his cabinet. So I don't know. I can say though that there is deep concern in the IG community, which actually may explain why SIGI, this group that we've spoken about, it's called I don't even know what the Academic Council on Inspector General's Efficiency. I'm forgetting what it actually means, but it's kind of like the internal sort of trade association, in the government, for IGs. So the head of SIGI is named Michael Horowitz. He's actually the Justice Department Inspector General. He's a very, very well-respected watchdog. But what we've seen actually in the past 2 weeks, since Steve Linick at State and Mitch Baer at Transportation were pushed aside, is that SIGI has actually been silent publicly. They've left it integrity and efficiency. Thank you, Kevin. And so I think that the fact that SIGI, I know there was internal debate about whether they should write a letter to the president or write a letter to Capitol Hill saying, we're really concerned about these firings. They've continued, but we noticed they've been silent. And I think there is a reason for that. And as one Inspector General said to me privately, there's just a big, a vast difference of opinion in the community about how they should proceed. This person said to me, some people want to go under a rock and just do their work. Others want to be outspoken, but the more outspoken the community is, the more that they risk Trump taking action against them. And, partly they don't want to be out of a job, but the other part is they feel like their duty is to actually have oversight over the Trump administration. So it's a very hard balance for them.
I'd just add to that, I think two things that Lisa said are really tell you all you need to know. One is that the inspectors general community assumes that the firings are going to continue, and two is that this Council of Inspectors General has been silent. And so it almost doesn't matter whether the president fires more of them, because he's kind of had the effect of silencing and intimidating this community by basically saying, if you do your job and perform investigations that are critical of me or my allies, you'll get fired. And that's a choice you need to make when you go to work every day. And that fundamentally changes what the ability of inspectors general to do the hard-hitting independent work that they're required to do.
And Chris, if I could just add to that. I think this raises the fundamental question for each inspector general of whether they're in the job to do the job or to hold the job. And if an inspector general is there to do the job, then he or she will continue, notwithstanding the administration's current posture, conduct the kind of hard-hitting audits and investigations that inspectors general are supposed to conduct and come to the conclusions that the facts lead them to. If they're in the job simply to be in the job, they will understand that to stay in the job requires muting and muzzling themselves. So it'll be very, very interesting to see in the weeks to come how the inspectors general handle themselves in this regard, including the new special inspector general, who, as you noted, Chris, was just confirmed yesterday.
Thank you very much, Clark. We're going to close out there. I just want to say one thing that because the messages in text that we get to the panelists don't get published in the chat and are part of the record. I just want to note for the record that we've been receiving a number of messages in the private side of the chat talking about what a good Inspector General Steve Linick was. People with personal experience with Steve Linick as an IG talking about what a great job he did and what a loss he was to the State Department, to the government, that he's no longer the Inspector General of State. I just wanted to make that part of the record. Thank you all, and thank you for an excellent program. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to the audience. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.